Okay, it looks like we're ready to get started. Welcome everyone to the Centrify Customer Success webinar, Expert Hour for SAML. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jake Hall. I am an onboarding consultant with Centrify for the Centrify Identity Service. I've been with Centrify for a little over 2 years now. My anniversary was in July, I believe. I'm based out of Boise, Idaho, and the reason that I'm here today is that I've been involved with implementing hundreds, possibly thousands of cloud-based SAML applications for the Centrify Identity Service. And I'm here to provide you with some of the basics of SAML. I'm here to have a discussion, a broad, open discussion with you on, what SAML is, okay, and how it can help your organization, okay? So feel free to chime in with any questions or concerns or whatever they may be, okay? So let's just go ahead and get started, shall we? Okay. So let's talk SAML, okay? So what does SAML stand for, okay? SAML is just a simple acronym for the Security Assertion Markup Language. Security Assertion Markup Language. And you may be asking yourself, well, that's great, but what is SAML? Okay. Well, and as a technical description, SAML is basically an XML-based standard, okay, for communicating identity information between organizations, such as yours and the cloud. That's all it is. But again, what does that mean exactly? What is it? What does it do? All right. Well, SAML effectively provides what we call single sign-on for your cloud-based applications, for cloud-based applications or on-premise applications, but it effectively provides what we call single sign-on. So what that means is that instead of entering a username and a password, your end user simply goes in and they click on a link and they're into whatever application they choose. So what does this do for you? Well, it increases security, right? The objective here is to eliminate unnecessary passwords. Effectively, we want to take a look at narrowing your identity perimeter. Okay, and in addition to that, it obviously decreases admin, help desk costs, and ultimately it boosts employee productivity. Okay, so what are the benefits of using SAML rather than a username password app? Well, it's a good question. So we're finding that more and more organizations are making their transition into the cloud. But inevitably, they are accumulating more and more identities and more separate passwords. And we're finding that this is across all of the apps and all of the utilities that they're using, okay? Oftentimes, and again, inevitably, they are creating and rotating passwords that are totally insecure, that are either easily forgotten, which again would result in a ticket to a help desk, and by the way, employee downtime, which can be incredibly frustrating to end users, incredibly frustrating to our employees. Or obviously in the worst case, passwords can be compromised, outright stolen, right? So let's take a very common software as a service vendor. Let's take Salesforce as an example. So Salesforce is one of our more popular apps. It's actually in our web apps catalog. It's tried and trusted and true. When an employee of an organization is hired, oftentimes someone from your IT team or even your Salesforce administrator will go in, provision an account, and create the end user's password, okay? then they'll typically go and send it to them, and then they'll have them change it immediately, upon the first login, right? And at that point, the user is now responsible for his or her password. They're responsible for rotating it, changing it. They're responsible effectively for managing it. It belongs to them. Well, let's be honest. I don't know about you, and I've been guilty of this as well. But I'm human. I'm guilty of reusing the same password across apps. I've done it before. I'm guilty of not changing my password regularly. I'm guilty of using weak passwords, and oftentimes we often see passwords being shared amongst individuals in an organization, right? We see weak passwords all the time. We see something ridiculous like password 123 or QUERTY, QWERTY, or something like, let me in, or 123456, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is obviously a problem for your IT team, but also your Salesforce administrator, because now they have to manage two identities, right? They have to manage your Active Directory username and password, as well as your Salesforce username and password. And whenever an employee is terminated, now the IT team has to go and disable the Salesforce user's account, or Dropbox user account, or whatever user accounts they have. Typically within minutes of the employee termination, they have to go in and manually repeat those steps for every software as a service app that user has an account in. So this is where SAML comes in. Okay, so a real power of SAML is the ability to manage identities in the cloud by enabling single sign-on. So using SAML, we don't store passwords in the cloud, and we don't require users to have to log into each application manually. They simply click a link and they're off. They're ready to go. There's nothing for your users to forget. There's nothing for your users to lose. Most importantly, there's no password that your user would have that could ever be stolen. The only thing that they need to remember is their Active Directory username, and that's pretty much it. Okay? So how simple is it to set up a SAML app in Centrify? Okay? Well, some new users might be saying to yourself, well, I don't know SAML. It's an XML-based language. I don't know XML. I don't know how to code. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's entirely okay, because, Centrify is taking care of the hard parts. SAML is remarkably easy to set up in Centrify, especially once you understand some of the fundamentals of it. First off, we have tons of pre-built SAML apps built right into our catalog. So what that means is that, once our web app is set up in Centrify, it's already been tried and tested to work right out of the box. So you simply go into the admin user interface, you search for the app you want, you install it in Centrify, with a single click, and at that point, you are already 50% done. You're effectively 50% done at that point. In addition to that, a lot of vendors out there will supply for us as an identity provider what's called metadata. Metadata is also an XML format, but what this allows us to do is it allows us to upload a vendor metadata file to sort of pre-populate our configuration for us. It populates all of the URLs that we need, all of the endpoints that we need, and everything is pre-configured for us. So, if in the event that your SAML vendor, it isn't in our catalog, which there's thousands of SAML vendors out there, then we just start with a custom SAML template. But, the great thing about SAML is that we know with 100% certainty that if your vendor supports the SAML 2.0 protocol, then we know that Centrify can support it, period. Okay? I like to think of SAML as a simple series of handshakes. So I'll go ahead and provide you with an analogy on that topic. So let's say that I'm in your neighborhood, and I walk up to your door and I knock on it. You answer the door. You don't know who I am, so what are you going to do? You're going to ask me for my credentials. And so I hand you a key, right? So you look at my key and you verify where it came from, but you can also check your own key, right, to make sure that it matches the one you have already. And additionally, you also verify that I'm allowed in the house in the first place. So once you verify that our keys are the same, we shake hands, okay, and you invite me in and I get to work, right? So in broader technical terms, what this means is that I authenticate to my own internal Active Directory with Centrify through the Centrify user portal. Alternately, I authenticate with Windows instead of your domain, using a root certificate, and we can talk about this later. Using a root certificate installed by your IT team using something we call integrated Windows authentication. We can talk about that more later, but essentially it provides a zero sign-on capability for your end users, so long as they're logged into Windows. So when I request access to an application, Centrify, it puts my details together. It verifies that I'm authorized to access the application, okay? It tells the software as a service vendor who I am, where I came from. Additionally, the vendor double checks who I am by asking Centrify to validate my identity. So remember we talked about the key. Once the vendor is satisfied that I'm authenticated but also authorized, then I gain access. Okay. So let's get into it a little bit, shall we? So what is a SAML assertion? What does a SAML assertion include? Okay, what happens between those handshakes? Well, a SAML transaction always includes what we call an assertion and a response, an assertion and a response. Okay, so in SAML, there's always three players. Okay. And I'll sort of split them out here for you. So we've got the identity provider, okay? We've got the service provider, and we've got the end user. So let's sort of split that off and let's talk about what the identity provider is for a second, okay? So the identity provider is Centrify, okay? So Centrify is going to take an end user's identity, remember, without the password, and it's going to parse XML into what we call a SAML assertion. The SAML assertion, it includes identifying information about the user. It includes, who you are, it includes where you came from, and what you're authorized to access, okay? Inside of a SAML assertion, among other things, we'll focus on the primary items here. We'll talk about the important items here. It includes some elements. Okay, it includes a name identifier, which is the unique identity of the end user. Okay, it includes something called an issuer. The issuer is a unique application-specific URL installed inside of Centrify. It effectively tells the vendor what application is sending that assertion to the vendor. Okay, we've got the assertion consumer service URL, sometimes called the ACS URL. The assertion consumer service URL is the URL that specifies where the SAML assertion is going. So it's typically on the vendor side, it's where the single sign-on service lives that will accept the incoming SAML assertion. Okay. Additionally, we've got the identity provider sign-in URL. So this URL is the URL that the vendor uses to notify Centrify that SAML single sign-on is happening. This is where the vendor sends their response back to begin the SAML transaction. And then lastly, we've got the X509 signing certificate. Okay, so this signing certificate is essentially enables both Centrify and the vendor, okay, to perform a handshake instead of using a password. Okay. And then we move on to the service provider. You know, the service provider is just the SaaS vendor, you know, like Salesforce. The service provider, essentially, it takes the SAML assertion, it interprets the SAML assertion, it validates the SAML assertion, and then it sends a SAML response back to the identity provider. And then the last player in this scenario is the end user. The end user has an account in Active Directory. The end user has an account with the identity provider, and once Centrify parses the SAML response, the end user is authenticated. Typically, the browser would then redirect back to the SaaS vendor, and they're in. And I wanted to make a note here again, since you know, since we're only sending quote key, right? There are no passwords involved in this transaction whatsoever. The key is actually a certificate. And our end goal here is to eliminate passwords, redundant passwords, old passwords, misused, misplaced, stolen passwords. Our end goal here is to eliminate passwords by using certificates instead, using SAML assertions. So, you know, it's important to note that, you know, SAML works in two ways. So with SAML, we've got what's called SP initiated, which is an acronym for Service Provider Initiated, and IDP initiated, or Identity Provider Initiated single sign-on. SP versus IDP initiated. And what this means is that if it's SP initiated, then the user will go to the vendor website first. You know, for example, login.salesforce.com. So what they'll do is they'll go ahead and click the login link. They'll enter the username. And here's the deal is, since the vendor knows that that user is part of an environment that's federated with Centrify already, meaning that Centrify effectively owns authentication into that environment, then they're redirected to Centrify to authenticate. Right? They're redirected to Centrify to authenticate against their own internal Active Directory first. So once they're authenticated via Centrify, via Active Directory, then they're redirected back to the vendor and they gain access immediately. Okay? And then, of course, if it's IDP initiated, Identity Provider initiated, then the user simply goes through the Centrify tile and logs into their app, and they're on their way. Okay. So what is a name identifier in a SAML assertion, in a SAML response? How do I find it? Right? Well, there are multiple elements in a SAML assertion, but the name identifier is probably the most important. The name identifier in a SAML response is the unique identity of the user that's authenticating. So it's always important that, you know, the username of the user in Centrify, the username of the user in Active Directory matches the username of the user in the vendor app, right? So if I've got a mail attribute of, you know, jake.hall@centrify.com, I want to make sure that my Salesforce account is matching jakehall.com. So in Centrify, we can always specify the account mapping. So this means that we can always change the username to something that exists already in Active Directory. So most commonly, I'll see something like the mail attribute being passed only, but sometimes I'll see something like, you know, user principal name or employee ID or SAM account name, something along those lines, right? In Centrify, we have a number of validation tools, okay, to ensure that while we're developing a SAML app, that we're setting it up to pass along the correct Active Directory attributes, such as mail, in the SAML assertion. We have what we call a test tool that essentially will put together the SAML assertion for us and allow us to review it, right, before we even try to authenticate, so that we can take a look at all of the elements of the assertion before we even attempt to log in. In this case, for the name identifier, we'd be looking for name ID and the format of the name ID. So we hit test, we test out a sample user, we find the name ID and the format in the SAML assertion, and then we double check that line in the SAML assertion matches the name identifier, the mail attribute, for instance, in Active Directory. And we also double check that that's what it is as a username in the vendor's application as well. Okay. So next question here, can I include custom attributes in a SAML response? Why would I need to? Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Oftentimes, SaaS vendors require, additional attributes to be passed along inside of a SAML response. So some of the more common ones I see are, for instance, employee ID or display name. Our SAML template apps in Centrify are entirely scriptable with JavaScript. So, as such, we'd go in, we'd include a line that indicates set attribute and then display name. At that point, when Centrify parses the XML response, it'll go in and find that display name and include it in the insertion. So let's see here. Next question, what is an array in a SAML response? What could an array be used for? Okay. An array in a SAML assertion it's a set of attributes that, instead of listing all attributes line by line, that they could be included in an array. So, for instance, AWS, Amazon Web Services, requires that we pass along a list of all roles that could be used for authorization, not authentication, but authorization. So a user in AWS could be part of multiple roles. And so we would be able to pass that along in an array. So if we include an array instead of a dozen single roles line by line, then Centrify will return all of the roles of that user with just one line instead of a dozen. Okay. How do we test a SAML assertion with Centrify? So again, Centrify has the ability to test a SAML assertion by going into any app that's installed in Centrify. We're essentially able to go into the advanced section of that app specifically, and we've got a test icon there. We've got a test link. So essentially, you just hit that test button, and then you take a look at the response. Typically, we'll start off by hunting around for the name ID or any additional required attributes. Okay. So what technical terms are sometimes interchangeable when we talk about SAML? I get asked this question a lot. When we're talking about SAML, a lot of interchangeable terms here. I hear token, right? I hear token a lot instead of assertion. I hear assertion instead of response. I hear key instead of certificate, and then in addition to that, oftentimes I work with WS-Fed, which, uses SOAP claims instead of attributes. And then ADFS uses a lot of the same terms as well. you know, and to make things more complicated than that, ADFS also supports SAML. But, you know, the challenge is that it's formatted entirely differently. But, you know, also important to know that Centrify also supports WS Federation as well. But ultimately, it's important to be able to fundamentally grasp what's happening. But at the end of the day, understand that what we're talking about is, again, it's just a series of handshakes. You know, handshakes, handshakes, handshakes. End user, identity provider, service provider, and your directory, right? What's the best way to determine where a SAML response is failing? Okay, well, there are a few tools I like to use when I'm working, you know, with a customer of mine and I'm working with a vendor, and there are thousands of them out there, right? Thousands of vendors out there, and they each handle things differently sometimes, but ultimately it's just SAML, so it's pretty easy to point out where the failure is happening. It's really important to be able to go in and trace, you know, where HTML headers are going back and forth, you know, between Centrify and the SaaS vendor. I need to be able to see where the posts are. I need to be able to see where the gets are in the HTML headers. And then I need to be able to determine where the SAML assertions and where the responses are landing. So if I, for instance, I open up a packet or a header tracer and I see that a vendor isn't posting a response back to Centrify, for instance, I know that the problem lies somewhere on the vendor configuration. We're just trying to target, you know, anomalies between Centrify and the vendor. And usually it's something simple like a missed URL or a space at the end of a URL or, you know, a missing character somewhere, okay? There are a few good tools out there. I like to use Fiddler, which is a packet sniffing tool. You know, another one of my favorites is it's a simple browser extension that you would go and install in Firefox. It's called SAML Tracer. It's a Firefox extension. It's just a simple extension installed right into your Firefox browser. I use it daily. Okay. Next question, can I script a Centrify application to include custom account mapping? Yes, sure thing. Our platform is extremely scriptable if you so desire. We can use JavaScript to concatenate. We can use JavaScript to split, to throw in a replace function, whatever we like. There's a lot of great things that you can do with JavaScript. For instance, we can take a user principal name attribute. And let's say that our user principal name attribute included jcall.local. Right? Well, that's not going to work because nobody uses .local as a username in a vendor app. So what we need to do is replace .local with @centrify.com. So we would use the replace function to replace .local with @centrify.com. Good stuff. Let's see. What else do we have here? Do we have any other questions from the audience? I do have a question here. Once deleted from Active Directory, is user access removed from the SAML integrated app? I'll repeat that question. Once access from Active Directory, once deleted from Active Directory, is a user access removed from the SAML integrated app? Absolutely, absolutely. So we have a number of options in Active Directory. We can disable a user, we can delete a user. And the way that that works, right, is we go into Centrify and we allow access via roles, right? So typically what we see is we see an Active Directory security group with a user inside of it. That Active Directory security group is mapped to a role in Centrify. That role in Centrify is mapped to the application so that only users inside of that role are able to access that application. So once a user is deleted from Active Directory, they lose access to the SAML integrated app. Now, it's important to note that a lot of SAML integrated apps, like Salesforce, for instance, they allow both single sign-on access, but they also allow username, password, forms-based authentication into an app. So it would be important to ensure that once single sign-on is set up and configured in Centrify, to go and remove username, password-based authentication from any app that you want to secure access to. Okay. So I've got another question here. Can an application be both service provider and identity provider initiated? And the answer is yes, absolutely, absolutely. Salesforce is a pretty good example. ServiceNow is a pretty good example, right? Dropbox is a pretty good example. So again, when we're talking about service provider initiated, they go to the service provider's landing page, like login.salesforce.com or, login.onmicrosoft.com. And what happens typically is that the user will go and, Office 365, for instance, the user will go to the Microsoft landing page. They'll punch in their username, jake.hall@centrify.com. And then since Microsoft understands that Centrify now owns federation to that environment, I'll punch in my username, I'll tab over, and then I'll get a trailing series of dots. And I'm immediately redirected back to Centrify to punch in my Active Directory password. Once Centrify is satisfied that I'm authenticated against your own Active Directory, I'm redirected back to Office 365. And the same premise goes with any vendor that supports SP-initiated authentication. I see it sometimes. I rarely see it that, if SP-initiated authentication is supported, that IDP isn't, but it happens from time to time. Okay. And it looks like we have another question in the chat window here from Carrington. In the event SAML is asking for a prefix that is not present, like domain/username. Let me see if I can pull that down a little bit here. In the event SAML is asking for a prefix that is not present, like domain/username, the SAML application is always going to be looking for the attribute that is identified in the account mapping section of the SAML app. It's always going to be looking for, if you specify the mail attribute, it's going to be looking for the mail attribute. If it's looking for the SAM account name, it's looking for the SAM account name. If in the event you needed to provide a username that included a domain / in front of it, we could easily script that to include the domain / in front of the username. We would simply go into the account mapping, and then we would go into the custom section, and we would use some JavaScript to include that prefix. Okay. Okay. Do we have any other questions from the audience? No? Okay. In that event, I would encourage all of the audience members here. Oh, wait, we have another question here. How to change the name ID format in a SAML response? Very, very good question. As I had indicated before, our SAML templates are very scriptable. in a custom SAML template, and in our web templates as well, we're able to go to the advanced section of that Centrify SAML app and change the name ID format. In the SAML response, we would go to the Name Identifier section. And by the way, a lot of these custom SAML templates have a lot of scripted out text in the advanced script section. So we would go and find the indicator that names name ID format, and we would go and change the format from, for instance, from email to whatever format is required by your vendor. Okay. So, next question here. I'm working on enabling SAML integration on a custom app, and it doesn't allow the uploading of XML, but it needs a direct download link. Is that possible? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I believe that we're talking about metadata here. So oftentimes it won't allow you to upload a metadata directly, but what Centrify does for us is that it actually provides our metadata back to the vendor. So I didn't talk about that before, but oftentimes vendors will provide us their metadata. Well, guess what? We provide vendors our metadata too, and there's two ways to do that. You can either download the XML directly to your desktop and then upload it to the vendor's website as well in their administrative interface. But we also provide a publicly accessible metadata file for our own metadata. So we've got two ways to do that: download the file directly, or just simply copy and paste a link to the metadata into the service provider's administrative single sign-on interface. Okay. Let's wait for a second, see if we have any other questions. Okay, so next question. Do we use SAML templates for provisioning, or is that done separately? So with Centrify, it's important to understand the fundamental difference between provisioning and authentication. So authentication is simply going to get a user into the application using single sign-on. Provisioning is something completely different, but oftentimes a Centrify web app will provide both of those features and functionality. Provisioning essentially allows your Active Directory administrator to drop a user into an Active Directory security group, and then within seconds, the Centrify Cloud Connector is going to sweep for those changes and then write back to your vendor application, whatever it might be. So two separate features, two separate functionalities here, right? So typically we first go and set up authentication, and then we would go and set up provisioning, okay? And provisioning, just like authentication, it has its own set of custom scripts that are fully modifiable, okay? Let me see, we have another chat here. Custom SAML template and scripted changes that is included in support or extra support hours charged for that if you need help outside of the original setup. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Outside of professional services and onboarding consulting, we absolutely do have support services available to help you configure applications in the event that you're running into trouble for whatever reason. A really good resource I can proudly say is that on www.centrify.com. They're very easily accessible, inside of any of the user interfaces in the Centrify Identity Service. You simply click, application help on the blue hyperlink, and that'll take you right to docs.centrify. And our docs team, honestly, has been pretty amazing. I rarely find a resource in there that is unavailable. Okay. But again, if you do have any, immediate needs for support, I'd like you to please reach out to customer success at centrify.com for any, professional services needs. I'll repeat that email address again. It's customer success at centrify.com. Okay, I have another question from the audience. Is SAML only for cloud applications? So again, it's important to remember that SAML is just a protocol. It doesn't matter if that application sits inside the cloud or if it sits behind your own firewall. SAML is going to work so long as we provide all of the elements that we talked about before, right? Those elements would include, the name identifier, the issuer, the assertion consumer service URL, the identity provider sign-in URL, and the certificate. But, in a nutshell, SAML is not only for cloud applications. If you have an application that sits inside of your firewall that supports SAML, then absolutely, we can configure that for you as well. Okay. Okay. So next question here. Is there a process to add a custom app to our catalog? Yes, absolutely. The reason that there are so many pre-built web apps inside of Centrify is that our customers reach out to us regularly and ask us to build vendor apps into our catalog. So the process is actually pretty simple. All you have to do is reach out to us, log a support case, and our team will guide you accordingly. Okay. Okay. Let's go ahead and stay online just a few more minutes to see if anybody has any additional questions. Feel free to post in the chat window. If you don't have any further questions, I would encourage you to go to community.centrify.com. If you have any other questions later, just go into community.centrify.com and post your question on that forum. I did have one last question here. Is there anything specific to SHA-256 certificates regarding SAML that we need to worry about? As a matter of fact, there's not anything we need to worry about. We are supporting SHA-256 as of, it's not the last release, the release before that. We were supporting SHA-1 before, but we do have the option here to provide SHA-256 or SHA-1. It's actually in a drop-down. An administrator is actually able to choose which type of cryptology they want to use. SHA-1 or 256, it's entirely up to you. It's your choice. Does Centrify provide certificate or support third-party certificates? Anything to consider there? Yeah, we actually do. We, in addition to the X509 citing certificate, it is possible to encrypt an entire SAML assertion. So not only is it encrypted via HTTPS using SSL, but we're able to include another level of encryption by essentially uploading your own certificate and having the entire SAML assertion encrypted. And that would be your own certificate, by the way. That is not a Centrify assigned certificate. That's not a Centrify built-in certificate. That would be your own certificate. Okay, one more question. Can you help us with a SAML setup issue? Absolutely, I would love to. That's what we're here for, your success, right? Go ahead and post it in the Centrify community. I will be more than happy to take a look at it and respond, okay? Go ahead and post any question you like in there. I will be happy to respond to anything you've got for me. Okay, I'll go ahead and give it another minute here, and if we don't have any further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, if you do have any further questions, feel free to go on community.centrify.com. Go ahead and log in and post your questions there. Okay, thanks for joining, everyone. Once again, my name is Jake Hall. I'm an onboarding consultant for Centrify Identity Services. Please feel free to post any additional questions you have at community.centrify.com, and have a great rest of your day.